Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for October 20th, 2023. I'm Benji Fisher moderating. And also on the call are several people, some of whom are at DrupalCon in Lille right now. Aaron McHale, Anmol Gul, Laurie Escola, Arthur Chal, Ralph Kohler, and Simo Hilsman. Thank you all for coming. Unless someone else has something they'd like to bring up, I'd like to start with this issue, use modals in field creation flow. For the sake of recording, the issue number is 3386762.
I'm just wondering if we could maybe start with just to summarize the conversation Laurie and I were having, because I don't know if you have to jump away to something else. So maybe we could, maybe we should start with that actually.
Okay, just one thing before you do that. I'm pasting into the Zoom chat a link to my local Drupal site shared via DDEV and ngrok. You can log in as admin. And this has the merge request for the issue I mentioned already applied. But go ahead, Aaron, Laurie.
Yeah, so this kind of relates to originally the issue that we looked at last week around the field UI and merging the field instances and field storage into a single form. So I can summarize my understanding, and then if you want to just jump in, feel free, and we can summarize for the group kind of what we've been talking about and kind of how we think we've got a good idea of maybe some things we can do going forward. So I approached Larry to talk about it because we did discuss it in the meeting, and I wrote a summary, but then I thought since it'd be at DrupalCon, it makes sense to discuss it in person and before we do anything else. So verbally, we sort of talked about it, and I brought up some of the concerns we had during the meeting, and then Larry also, I think you would listen to the transcript of the meeting. I think the key thing is like there's some of the concerns we brought up we agreed were valid concerns. The thing we we talked about is that there on that specific issue, like and quite a lot of the field UI ones, there's a lot of work was in advance, that actually there was quite a lot of user testing was done in advance of that, and actually of the prototypes and mock-ups that had been done prior to the implementation. So one of the things we talked about is how in the field creation flow, actually, when I particularly when I saw it at DrupalCon, and I saw like the how that works when you're creating a field, it's actually it does feel quite a nice flow to have everything in one form. And also a lot of the issues we raised really are relevant only if you have more than one instance of a field. So if you have only one instance of a field, then having like the field instance config and field storage config on the same form is actually not as big of an issue. But as I said, we did discuss some of the specific concerns we had around things like the accessibility of jumping between, like, let's say you tab between you start in a form and you're editing a field that's part of the field instance, then you tab to a field for the field storage. And we discussed some of those, and we agreed that what we would do is actually create some follow-up issues to look at those specifically. And that's something that you said you were particularly keen at looking at, where we could make improvements. And also we talked about how actually we could make more improvements to the layout of the field, sort of the edit form, to make it sort of clear where things are a field specific to the instance and where they are related to the storage. Is there anything you want to come in on those things just now, Laurie?
If you want to, maybe you can mute yourself.
Yeah.
All right, so I do want to add one comment to that, where we discussed a little bit about the process as well, like what would be the best way to involve this group in the processes that we are doing. And I want to highlight that the process that we've been using is new for us. So we've been also experimenting with the process, and now based on the feedback that I heard from Aaron, I believe that he was representing the group well based on that, reading the transcript, that you would like to be involved in the process. And what I think we should do is try to involve this group as early as possible in the process. And what that means is that's around the design phase of the implementation. So before we actually even implement production quality code, we have a discussion with the group and get feedback on the designs before we even implement anything. And then we have sort of we could address some of that feedback early on in the process. And that's something we didn't take into account when we've been trying this process, but yeah, something that we can take into account going forward. Obviously, that's different for issues that, if there's issues in the Drupal issue queue where people propose features without actual design or user research in the beginning, obviously those issues can only be reviewed after they are implemented. So, the process might be a little bit different for, depending on whether there is actual UX design done early on in the process versus when there's just someone proposing a change to Drupal.
Yeah, and we also talked about how it's sometimes not easy to know from the usability group whether an issue has previously had user research done and how much testing was done. So that's something we also talked about, where maybe we could make that more visible in issues so that the group is aware of when things have been done, and even potentially like a summary of what the outcomes. So like we talked about, we don't want to, for various reasons, share the specific recordings or specific transcripts, but we could at the very least provide a summary that says, these tests were done and this was the key findings from those tests and things like that. So the group is more informed when it comes to reviewing things. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. We've also had some discussions where me and Christina, we are reviewing some of the processes and trying to establish them in a way where they're documented somewhere. And that makes it clear that, we have clear expectations from, everyone who is involved in what stage, we expect what kind of involvement from each other. So just, I guess, documenting some of this in a more formal way so that it's more transparent to everyone.
Yeah, that's something I've been quite keen on for a while, just never had the time to start looking at as well. And something we also talked about is how when we leave feedback on an issue and when we talk about doing the reviews, maybe like having some kind of like having a more like a formalized template, and something we talked about is phrasing our feedback in a way that that doesn't preclude any continued discussion, because like I think you put it quite well that sometimes for contributors, when they see a comment that has like lots of well-known contributors attached to it, even if we try and use like terms like suggestion and recommend, like that still carries a lot of weight when we maybe don't necessarily mean it to. So we were talking about the idea where we could, like, when we leave a review, phrase as like, here's the problems we discovered and here's some ideas as to how we could address that, so that it doesn't imply that, because we don't always mean that this is the way something has to be done. We still want to encourage people to contribute and to bring alternative ideas and to be able to bring things up. So that was another thing I thought was a really good idea that we could, as part of those processes, we could look at. So I think that's everything. I appreciate that was a lot of information to throw at the group, and I'm sure we'd be happy to take any questions on kind of those conversations we had and clarify anything.
So what are the first steps we should be taking to implement some of these ideas? Does someone want to draft a template for usability reviews? Can we expect to see some documentation on how processes are going? And are we actually changing long-established practices like having usability and accessibility as core gates?
Yeah, I think the core gates discussion is a good question, and I have lots of thoughts on that, where I do think we want solutions that we build be usable, but I also think that we need to look at that there's a scale of things, and like we need to understand that if we have sideways movement on issues, for example, that we don't need to solve all of the issues in a single issue, that we can make iterative progress towards things. And if we and sometimes even if we have meeting a gate could happen, in my opinion, in cases where you have 9 things that you improve and then you have one minor regression to that. Like I still think it's a net win for us. Sometimes we have to compromise a little bit so we can make everything perfect, and that's how we can have that rapid progress in our issues. I'm happy to take on drafting some of the process parts and make a proposal maybe in the upcoming few weeks, and then I would be happy to send it for review from this group as well.
Okay. Thomas?
So I'm sorry, I walked in really late, so I've only caught the last bit, but so I'm responding to what Lori just was speaking about. However, it sounds like we are going to be discussing changing the core gate of usability. However, historically speaking, I seem to recall that we had a lot of usability challenges back in the day. And that the reason for including it was that when left to their own devices, individual developers were not taking the time to bring issues to any form of usability review, and adding the core gate, while it can be pretty easy to say, hey, as a developer, I feel that this particular issue doesn't need to be held up in usability. Removing the core gate means that it's going to be opt-in rather than opt-out. And it would be really sad to revert to the days of Drupal 6 usability versus where we've been able to really move more recently. I would hate to see us regress as a project from something that has brought a lot of good. And I feel that what we have today is far superior to where we used to be.
So I do want to respond to that. I'm not saying that we should be removing the gate. I personally believe more in principle kind of thinking over gates, where we have a principle that we want to make Drupal usable in everything that we do. And that allows us to think it in a way like, if this improves, if this is a net win for our usability, even if there's one regression to usability in some small part of the change, that could still meet the principle that we are trying to make the project more usable. Whereas when you think about gates, it always means that everything needs to be usable, but then it's again, how usable does it need to be? It's like, because
it's who's making the determination. Who determines whether or not something is usable? Is the individual generating the patch or coming up with the solution the one to determine that? So it feels very circular. If the person determining whether or not something meets the need of usability or is a regression, it's important to separate the person taking the action from someone reviewing the action.
Right, and ultimately that's up to the core committer to decide whether the gate has been met. And as individuals with an interest in usability, we can all give usability reviews for individual issues. This group is not the only one with the authority to say that something passes the gate. I think probably Christina and Roy, as the usability topic maintainers listed in maintainers.txt, have more authority than we do. But the gate is there, and ultimately it's the core committer who decides.
I'm also wondering, what is the concern? Is it like slowing down and we want to not having slow? Because I think, at least in this group, whenever I can join, things are being discussed and moving on. And sometimes I might see like bike shedding concerns, but I didn't see in this group that we had a lot. Like we taking concern of like, this is something that can be dealt with, but perhaps something can get in and have a ticket for near future that will deal with that specific regression or something.
So I do want to give a specific example that we did have some specific usability issues that we were aware of when we worked on the designs for the field UI. For example, the label field, which is on the displayed before the field types, was something that users often forgot to fill before moving to the next step. But so that's a usability issue with it. But then it was decided or recommended by the usability researchers that since this is not going to be the final design that we implement, that this is something that did not prevent anyone from actually using the software. It was more a convenience problem. It was annoying. So it was declared at that point that the fact that we can make iterative progress on that issue is more valuable than trying to solve that issue somehow in this middle step issue. So that's an example of where, we made a pragmatic decision that, this is a usability issue that we are aware of, but we believe that it's not severe enough that it would actually make sense for us to fix it at this point.
How does that necessitate changing how the group operates, though? Because it sounds like the system worked as is, as intended. And so there wasn't any holdup.
I don't think I'm not saying that this even means that there's a change in how the group operates. I'm mainly just trying to communicate how we made those decisions in that progress and how would we do that in future so that there's transparency between the groups, how that is done. Because I feel like there's been occasionally, questions about that. Are we following the same process that we did before? And maybe there has been some changes to how we approach things, because I do believe that if you apply the gates sort of thinking, technically that is against the usability gate, because it is a usability issue that we are introducing in that issue.
I mean, all I would suggest is that it then be documented. Like, I don't think, I haven't heard any talk from within our group about any frustration or from other sources. It's more that if there's an override for whatever valid reason, it's simply documented that, hey, this is a short-term fix because of X, and then move on.
Yeah, I think the documentation is the key point. And as Laurie said, we have to work on the transparency. And we have methods for that. There are meta issues. There are follow-up issues. And as a back-end developer, I know how tempting it is to dive into the code and make changes. But I also have a bit of experience, and I know how important it is to let people know what's going on and have not just the code, but also a description of what the code is supposed to be doing. And we all know that issue descriptions are too often neglected.
Yeah, one of the, which I guess for Thomas the benefit actually as well, like we were just talking about, I was saying how Laurie and I were talking about how this group could be involved more in the earlier stages. So again, with the field UI, going forward, we might want to, have prototypes and mockups actually presented to the group, so the group has that opportunity to provide input at those early stages, and then also like on issues have a bit more context about like, if user research was done and what kind of a summary of that research was. One of the other ideas actually that we talked about that could be was kind of we were just bike shedding on ideas as like for things like the field UI where we want to like iterate quickly. We could maybe look at some kind of a lot of systems have the ability to like opt into like beta features, like you can, that's quite common these days, and maybe that's something that we could look at potentially for Drupal core. Is like, you could say as a site owner, I want to see things that are in core that are maybe still being like UI changes that are not quite 100% yet, but it might give us an opportunity to get more feedback. So that was like one idea that came completely out of the blue. There wasn't any kind of like, it was just as we were having a conversation, I was like, okay, that could actually be quite an interesting pattern to explore further for Drupal as to whether we do something like that.
Sorry, and that wasn't out of the blue. We discussed the possibility of making the field UI changes into an experimental module.
Yeah, so one of the I guess in this case it was like we talked about I mentioned like an experimental module, and this was a kind of alternative idea for like how we could have something where, because for like an experimental module the site has to like maintainers to actively go and enable it, whereas we you were talking about how you didn't want to have as much of a, like, how did you describe it? I guess is, I don't want to paraphrase you too much.
Laura, you're muted.
Yeah, so there were several reasons why we thought that we would prefer not to go with that approach. Was first that it could be really challenging to get people to enable a module like this, so we would actually not be getting lots of feedback on this. Second reason was that because we need Contrib to be on board with some of the changes that we are making, it would be challenging to actually get a realistic sense of the experience if it was in an experimental module. It would take much longer than what it's taking currently, because of people are updating their modules to get updated to be compatible with the new field UI immediately, or
Okay,
much faster, because they know that it's coming.
I declare bike shedding.
Then third was the timeline. So if we go to experimental, it just means that it takes much longer for us to actually make those improvements, and then we get to the point where like someone like, you know, Acquia might not be as interested anymore in investing it, because it adds to the cost of you know, making those changes.
Can you tap him on the shoulder? I declare bike shedding. I don't want to discuss the difference between having an experimental module and having an opt-in feature for beta. But what I do want to focus on are the next steps, and Laurie has already said he'll be drafting some documentation. Is there anything else we should be doing in the near term?
Okay, yeah, so I'll just say that, like, this is something, because this is a conversation that we've been having, and it's something that I'm quite keen. There was basically my plan with the immediate field UI issue was to I'm going to be filing some follow-up issues for the specific concerns, and and Laura's really keen to take a look at those and see if we can what we can do to address them. Yeah, I think you know, I'm also quite keen on inputting into those kind of processes and things. So yeah, I suppose those are two specific next steps that will happen.
Okay. So let's move on. It's almost half past the hour. Let me share my screen again. Give me a minute. And
just there's one final thing before we do. I just want to thank Laurie for jumping on the call at such short notice, because I literally went over and tapped her on the shoulder and giving up the time, because I know it's very busy today. So yeah, thank you for coming on, and it's great that we were able to have these conversations today, and over the week.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the work that you're doing. So I'm gonna work on those next steps and maybe come back to the meeting in maybe in a week or two. I will let you know upfront when I can come next time. All right, I have to drop. So thanks everyone.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
And thank you, Aaron, for offering to file follow-up issues. I know that Simo and I think also Ralph have also been creating new issues, and the issue I'd like to talk about today is 3386762, use mobiles in field creation flow. I see in the chat, Simo put in a link to a Google Doc where he has some comments on this issue. But I also want to say this issue is one of the children of the plan to improve the field creation experience. So this is the meta issue for all the changes that Larry and his team have been working on. The issue number is 3346539. So I think we've added some of these child issues. This is one that Simo added. And probably any additional issues that you create, Aaron, are likely to be children of this as well. Any follow-ups to the things that have already been done here?
I'll figure out exactly where we create them soon.
Okay. And use modals issue is one of them, and combining field storage and field instances on one form is one of the fixed issues. Children of this. Introducing groups. Those are some of the things that we've discussed in recent meetings. So use modals in field creation flow is another issue, part of that big push. Last night I rebased the merge request, solved some merge conflicts, and the site I shared in the Zoom chat. It's not this. This is the Tugboat QA with an older version of it. This is my site where I've merged with the latest 11.x. So if I just go to structure, content types, let's take basic page, manage fields. So let's walk through, understand, this is under active development. There are some things that are obviously broken. We don't have to point out everything. But you know, as early as we can, we'd like to help provide some feedback on this. And thank you, Ralph, for putting the issue into Zoom chat. So if we create a new field, this screen now pops up in a modal. If you remember, selecting several of these are groups. Some of these are individual field types. So I think that Boolean is an individual field type. Link is probably an individual field type in email, but most of the others are groups. And we noticed that in the previous version, in what's currently in core, if you choose one of these groups, it opens up in a part of the page below what we currently see, which we thought was problematic. Now, when you open up one of these groups, you get a new screen in the modal. So the label we noticed was an easy thing to miss. I think it's less easy to miss in its current position. On this form, you can choose plain text or you can choose long plain text. I do notice one problem, that the label field is not marked as required, but if you try to go on to the next step without putting in the label field, you'll see that it is required. Not only is the label field required, but the machine name is required, and it's a little confusing to have these two parts of the error message without unhiding the machine name. But once I start entering a label, the machine name field becomes unhidden, and then I can continue. Before I go any further, any comments on these first two steps?
I could point out that if you now edit the machine name and delete it, and then try to continue, then you have a reference that you have another error message that you need to provide a machine name, but it resets automatically the machine name to the label. So that's something that's not announced in the message, that the machine name was reset automatically. So that's something that maybe for someone who doesn't notice that it happened. So if you just leave it blank.
Okay, I think that probably falls under the category of this is something that's still under development, and we don't have to point out every problem here. Ralph?
Well, that's actually just error message, adding to the error message kind of thing.
Okay. And certainly has to be documented and fixed at some point, but go ahead, Ralph.
One detail, I already forwarded, if you could go to change field type maybe and select Boolean instead. It is also a bit odd to have a single label field standing alone. From my perspective, it might, I don't know if it's technically possible, but if it would be possible to leave the label field onto the next step, basically where you define the whole field settings, and leave the first two steps or the first step in case of something like Boolean to the selection of the type.
Okay, so the general issue is that there's we need to have some generic way of splitting up the steps in this modal process, and it's not going to work well for all cases. Thomas?
So in general, I think I like what I'm seeing. I'm wondering. So I'm seeing an opportunity for something to consider. In one instance, we could mark it as a required field. If you go back to where we were entering in the label, so I'm talking about the label. Sorry. So one option is to automatically put the little red star so that it makes sense that an error is going to come, and to show a partial machine name so that the errors make more sense. So I think that's one solution or one direction, but an alternative that would be different than how we've historically done it would be to auto-generate a sample label which would fill in the space and it would make things visible. And it means that if someone just wanted to click through and create a field, it could create like Boolean field 1 and increment through. And I get that this is a change from historical, but I'm trying to present it as we can keep everything the way it is. And I like what I'm seeing, but one way is to try and fix it so that the error messages make sense. And the other way is to fix it so that you don't run into the error messages by automatically having a potential label in the field when you start. I don't know if that's desirable. I just wanted to suggest that we could solve the problem in two ways.
Okay. Ralph, go ahead.
And one small addition about the general navigation. One detail to note, me as a user, when oops, you already left, unfortunately.
I go back to Boolean.
Yeah, you could take Boolean, for example, because if you're in the second step and you press the change field type, you get back to the first step. If you now continue and are on the last step side on the field settings 1, and then press the just go ahead and click Boolean, for example.
Okay.
Enter label. And continue. And for example, a Boolean was a bad example. Anyway, if you would have a field with options and then click the change field type, I would have expected to go back to the second step where I was able to change the option, but you again go back to the first step with change field by pressing. That is
okay.
confusing detail.
So here I have plain text, and I put in a label, and I choose plain.
Plain, and now you continue, and then you remember, oh, I just wanted plain long, and you press change field type because I expect it's a back, but now you go the whole way back instead of an incremental step backwards.
Okay, so perhaps rather than specifically a change field type button, we should have the option of going back to the previous step, whatever that was.
Yeah, and that brings me to the other general detail. In general, I like the way it is presented and done in the modal. It's good, but it would be provide more context if to the title of the modal add field plain text. In that case, for example, step 2 out of 3 is added or prepended. That way the user is basically doesn't know in which step of the flow he or she is and how many steps there actually are. Because at the moment, previously there were pages that were disconnected sort of and you got lost in the flow. Now you have several display views on a modal and you're in the same way sort of lost. But if you provide some anchor and information stating where you actually are in those steps, would help from my perspective.
Okay, and I think having the continue button and the change field type or go to previous step button, I think a natural place to put that information would be on the same line. To indicate what steps there are in the form and where you are. I'm getting a thumbs up from Thomas.
Also here, the error messages, if you don't choose an option, they refer to the page title of this model it's not shown. But there is also, if we are changing, like making so that there are steps, also it could be fixed, because if you don't choose an option here, the error message says that you should select subtype, but subtype is not mentioned in that form. So it's using different term, and that term refers to if this would be a page, it would be the page title. So that's another thing, just.
Okay, so if you try to submit the form without choosing anything, subtype is not text that appears anywhere on the form. So let me cancel and go back. Another sort of serious bug, which just shows how raw this is, how this is not an issue that's ready for review. But another problem I noticed here is that whatever label you give it, whichever option you choose, it's not this step, but the next step on the form that has the problem. You enter a value for a select list. If you try to add another item or go back or save or change field type, any of those seems to trigger the change field type option, and we go back to the previous step. Although this actually is going back one step, which is what we wanted. Anyway, as this obviously isn't the intended behavior. But it's currently broken, and that's probably related to the recent changes in how select lists work in the UI. Go ahead, Thomas.
I think it's just I agree with everything that's been said. I was just going to point out that it looked like where it says choose an option below, the issue is that subfield type means what option is meaning or vice versa. And so whatever language they want to go with, they just need to unify around that language, and that's related to that particular piece of text on the page. Now, I don't know if someone's going to understand. So we, Ralph mentioned having like step 1 of 3. I don't know if in addition to that, it might be good to have like step 2, pick subtype or something. Like there may be a way to, or pick option, however, whatever language they get behind, there may be value in making certain it's mentioned in all of the appropriate places, including the button to go back and forward. Or I guess back, it really isn't forward. But that's what I'm seeing. And it would help me understand their intent if all of the things were aligned.
Right. And an easy slip of the finger, you might accidentally hit enter and trigger the primary submit button, which is continue. Oh, and again, maybe that doesn't. I wonder, how about if I click into the label and then hit enter? There we go. Oh, well, that's interesting. It's no longer a modal.
And there you can see the subfield.
So where can you see subfield?
Uh,
Up here?
in the title. So it's not actually subtype, but subfield.
Oh,
Add subfield.
Oh, up here, yes. So that was interesting. Go ahead, Ralph.
on the first step, one detail that came up yesterday in the accessibility office hours is also aside the ability to tap through the available field types, also provide the ability to navigate by cursors. So you're able up, down, left, and right.
And this is something that we brought up with the previous version, the one that's already in core.
Yeah.
That this looks like a grid, but it's actually
But
a list.
But back then, they were radio buttons, but they aren't anymore, if I'm not completely wrong.
Yeah, this is actually changed so that these are not radio buttons,
Yeah.
and they don't act as radio buttons. So you can't actually navigate with arrow keys at all. So it's only tabbing. But on the next step, you have still radio buttons, and that's kind of problematic because there we have different method of navigating with keyboard, so it's inconsistent. So on one place you navigate the options by tabbing, and on the next step you navigate the options by key up and down or left and right key, but tabbing goes to the next section.
Okay, I can navigate with cursor or by shift tab, 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 tab. Oh, and once I've selected a radio button, I can't get to the other one by tabbing. I can only get to the other one with the cursor keys. Yeah, that's an inconsistency.
This is also something that I asked yesterday from in the accessibility meeting, that this is something that can, having those radio buttons there visible can be something that's difficult for cognition. So it's kind of okay to have those as radio buttons, but when it's not when it's inside a container, it can be confusing for sighted user.
So we have about 10 minutes left. So there are a lot of things here. And I think at this point, a useful thing to do would be to go to the issue. Let me reload the page just in case someone else has commented on it recently. What I'd like to do is update the remaining tasks section of the issue summary and document some of the things that have to be dealt with. Again, it's early. It's too early to be really giving a review, but I think that if we list some of them in generic terms, that will help make sure that they don't get overlooked. Ralph, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. So remaining tasks, and if you read the guidelines, there are links down here. If you read the guidelines, the remaining tasks should always be a numbered list, and you can add things to the list, but don't delete things, don't insert things into the list, so that when people refer to remaining tasks by number in the comments, it continues to make sense. And then as tasks are completed, we use the strike through text. So, so one is that make sure that selection lists work. Currently, resubmit button goes to the previous mobile. I might update this later with a reference to the comment that I made last night. Make sure error messages use the same terms as the field labels. Use buttons or rate. I guess they're actually links or radial buttons consistently, so that keyboard navigation is consistent in the various mobile screens. Make sure that keyboard shortcuts like enter, control, enter, tab, the expected results. What other things have we brought up?
Ralph mentioned listing like step one of one of three, two
Oh,
of
yes.
three, something like that.
Indicate where we are in the process. Something like step 3 of 5, or list all the steps. Get the indication, the active one.
And also align the back button to the pattern. At the moment, it always jumps back to the first step.
Place the, what was it? Select a field?
Change
Select a
field type.
Thanks. Change field type button with one that goes through the previous step. Oh, and sort of simple and mark required fields, label as required, like not label, like label.
And one detail I have forgot to mention, for field types that have options, and if those options, in contrast to, for example, the reference field type, have also some sort of description underneath the bulleted point, for screen readers, those aren't announced automatically and not necessarily noticed.
So let's just make a sort of generic suggestion that we make sure it works with keyboard navigation and screen readers. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Would you rather be more specific and mention that the, what is it, these
Yeah, these descriptions for timestamp, for example, ideal for using data in time calculations or comparisons, not necessarily are announced like other descriptions automatically. If you tap to that field option, then the description isn't announced automatically.
make sure the descriptions of field groups and field types, I think that's the term the developers are using for this process, that these are the groups, and then within a group we have types.
Yeah. On the
make sure that the descriptions of these are announced.
Yeah. On the first step it works and it is announced, but on the second step for the options not.
So maybe there are actually three things here: field groups, field types, and options. Or should I go back to just saying field groups and field types?
So all the pieces there you go. So we have Anna and Elsa, and Mini Anna, Olaf, and
Stimo, I think we're getting some background noise.
Oh, sorry. I switched device and forgot to mute myself.
Okay. Okay, we have just 2 minutes left. I think I'll leave this as a draft comment here and submit it later. Whoops. As I said, it's supposed to be a numbered list. I'll go so far as previewing. And I will add a comment to go along with it. But, and I think it goes without saying that they need to make the automated tests pass. And I guess the consensus is that this generally works better than the previous version. The modal flow idea is a good one. It just needs work, which of course they have not. No one has marked this issue as ready for review yet. It is still in development, but the general direction looks like a good idea.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Of course, if you have anything to add, think of something later. Please comment on the issue yourself. And we are at the end of the hour, so thank you all for coming. And I do hope that we can get this issue finished, usable and accessible in time for Drupal 10.2, because I would really hate to change the admin experience in 10.2 and then change it again radically in 10.3.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Benji.
Thanks, Benji.
And of course, we'll do it again next week.
Have a nice weekend.
Yep, have a nice weekend.
Okay.